Okay. Fairfax County Public Library welcomes you to Great Decisions, America's largest public discussion of critical world affairs. This month's timely topic is Putin's Russia. Our guest discussant is George Washington University professor Dr. Henry Hale. Our moderator, retired Foreign Service Officer Mike Carpenter, will introduce Dr. Hale for opening remarks after we now view the Foreign Policy Association video on our topic. Here's looking forward to a lively and informative exchange of views. Okay, one moment.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to Great Decisions 2022, a masterclass brought to you by the Foreign Policy Association. Topics 1, 2, and 3 are non-traditional in nature. They're not the stuff of old-fashioned geopolitics and geostrategic struggles among major powers. For these next 3 foreign policy challenges, Russia and the United States, Myanmar and ASEAN, and the Quad Alliance, were on more traditional terms. Today's topic, of course, is U.S.-Russian relations. We begin with an overview of the Russian Federation. It is an incredibly large nation-state. The Soviet Union was the largest country in the world. It broke up into 15 different countries, and yet the Russian Federation, which of course succeeded it, remains the largest country to be found. Its population is at 146 million. It is the 11th largest economy in the international system. And finally, and quite importantly, the Russian Federation is a nuclear superpower. So where does Russia get its strength? Part of it is leadership. Since the beginning of this century, Vladimir Putin has been the dominant political actor in the country. He has been quite stable and consistent in his leadership, even though there are many Western objections to his style and to his foreign policy. At home, he has kept that country together. Secondly, you have a very strong military, both conventional and nuclear. That gives Russia a great deal of global strength and presence. Thirdly, the diplomatic corps is impressive, and the intelligence agency is pervasive in the international system. The Russian predecessor, the Soviet Union, like its predecessor, the Russian Empire, had a very large diplomatic footprint that has not changed. And finally, Russia is home to a remarkable wealth of resources. It has more gold than any country in the world, more silver, more oil, more fresh water. It is just an amazingly large bastion of natural resources. Being able to access those resources is a separate question, but the Russians do possess them. This is the image of Russia and its leader that Vladimir Putin would like for the world to always see, sort of that rough and rugged approach, taming the wild bear that one would not want to corner. What is Vladimir Putin's strategy in foreign policy? The first is to promote autocratic or non-democratic rule abroad. Vladimir Putin will assist in undermining democratic institutions in other countries to gain favor with emerging dictators. Secondly, he is fighting in relatively modest or low intensity proxy struggles with the United States. The Russians would not directly engage the Americans. We have devastating military power in comparison, but the Russians can try to undermine our allies abroad and align with our adversaries. Thirdly, he hopes to reverse the Cold War's end. Putin has spoken about the disintegration of the Soviet Union as an historic catastrophe that should be reversed. He can make modest gains along these lines, grabbing Crimea several years ago as an example, pressuring Belarus and Georgia, Kazakhstan and Ukraine, other examples. He's not going to be able to reverse, however, the independence of the vast majority of those countries. And finally, his aim is to undermine Western unity. As long as the United States is aligned with France and England, Germany and Italy, Japan and Australia, the Russians will always be in a secondary position. He would like to see Western powers divide, disagree, and separate. And of course, he's making every effort to promote that. Without any doubt, the Russians were promoting Brexit through social media pressures. And without any doubt, the Russians are promoting divides within the West European continent over issues such as COVID mandates, immigration, and EU law between Poland, Hungary, Germany, Italy, and others. So undermining Western unity is yet another part of Russia's strategy. Very meaningful debate happened in 2012, perhaps the most impressive foreign policy debate at the presidential level. This, of course, between Mr. Romney, the challenger, and Mr. Obama, the president. It was over the strength of Russia. Is Russia our number one geopolitical threat, or is it nuclear weapons in general, the Islamic State, climate change, or some other threat? And these two had a very impressive debate over where Russia fits in our geopolitical concern levels. Russo-American relations over time have been in flux. They've changed rather dramatically as the global context changes. This line we place on the graph we'll call neutrality. Anything above it would be warm relations. Anything below it would be cool or cold relations. Up until 1917, I would say the United States and Russia were largely neutral towards one another. They certainly knew of each other's existence. They calculated that into their foreign policy, but we weren't really engaged in Europe, and the Russians weren't really engaged in our hemisphere. In 1917, that would change because of the Russian Revolution and the advent of the communist Soviet Union. Our relationship with the Russians became very cold after 1917 and remained so until the late 1930s. But we needed the Russians because the Soviet Union was a potential ally against Nazi Germany. It became one of the Allied members fighting against the Axis powers, and so our relationship was much warmer. It doesn't mean we cared for the Soviets, nor did they care for us. Very minimal levels of trust, an anticipation that once this war was over, the two of us will go back to our chilled relationship, but at the time, necessity dictated an alliance against the Germans, Italians, and Japanese. When World War II was over, our relationship became very cold. First, it was the atomic bomb, the advent of the hydrogen, the nuclear and thermonuclear, regional conflicts, global ideological disagreement. The relationship could not be any worse without there being an outright war between the two superpowers. When the Cold War ended, Mr. Yeltsin came to power and he accommodated almost every American demand on Europe, on NATO, on Russian behavior. This was a very warm period for U.S.-Russian relations. But then with the arrival of Mr. Putin, the relationship began to decline, get cooler and cooler over time, to the point that today I would say it's somewhere between the peak in the 1990s and the depths of the 1960s and 70s. I would call this a normal relationship among major powers. Mr. Trump showed a warming to Russia when he was inaugurated as president in 2017. Why would he do that? Well, in part because he seems to have a healthy respect for strong men, and very few are stronger than Vladimir Putin. The America First approach demands it. In order to pursue a foreign policy based on America First principles, you must convince your allies that adversaries are not as threatening as they appear. This allows you to justify retracting from the world. A recognition of common interests between Russia and the United States. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, It's been the norm for more than 3 decades now. Bill Clinton tried to reset relations with the Russian Federation. He was largely successful in doing so. The junior George Bush made the same effort with Vladimir Putin, as did Obama, and of course, as did Mr. Trump. In fact, I think Joe Biden is going to be the first U.S. president since the Cold War not to attempt to reset relations with Russia and improve our dialogue on a daily basis. In order to consider American foreign policies towards Russia, we must first take into account the question of rise. Is Russia on the rise? Number 2, what are its main vulnerabilities? And finally, what is the extent of this great power threat that emanates from Russia? We begin with Russia and its position moving forward. There is a perception game going on in world politics as it relates to Russia. If we were to ask Vladimir Putin, what is the trajectory of Russia moving forward, he would say things were very, very bad in 2000. That's when he came to power. But over the course of the past 2 decades and moving forward for the rest of the century, things look rather rosy. Russia has reestablished itself as a great power. It is reasserting itself in global affairs. It is increasingly ambitious and risk acceptant. If we were to poll the foreign policy establishment members, and there are thousands of people that make up the U.S. foreign policy establishment, they would probably disagree with Vladimir Putin on everything except 2000. Everyone agrees that in 2000, Russia was in a lot of trouble. They would recognize that Vladimir Putin did straighten out the Russian Federation, did give it strength, but they're not nearly as bullish or optimistic about Russia's power and influence by the end of the century. The trend line, however, is positive. When I look at this situation, I analyze Russia, and I'll call this my reality. I see very minimal gains after 2030 and rather sharp declines around 2040. I am not impressed with Russia moving forward. It is to me a great power in clear decline with highly recognizable vulnerabilities, and that is going to be a significant factor in our calculation of foreign policy options. What are the country's vulnerabilities then? Why am I so unimpressed with Russia? Well, it unfolds on all 3 of the most important variables for determining a nation's future. You might remember this slide from the very first lecture on demographics when I expressed how population is a very important variable for determining future movement. But for the Russians, all 3 of these are highly negative. The geography is not very impressive. I mean, granted, you've got lots of natural resources, you can't get to them. They're in the frozen tundra of Siberia. Insurance costs will drive you out of business. Infrastructure is non-existent. The river system is impressive in terms of linear calculation, but these rivers are not like the Mississippi, the Colorado, or so many other American waterways. Our rivers connect large population centers. It makes them perfect vehicles to navigate for trade. That's just not the case in Russia. Most of their rivers dump into oceans that no one would use, and they go towards population centers that are remarkably small. So geographically, Russia does not impress me. Geostrategically, well, when you eyeball it, you think Russia's in a pretty good position. It's at the top of the world. It dominates the Arctic. It doesn't have that many borders with other great powers. But in reality, there are 4 significant geostrategic weak spots for Russia. The first is what we used to call Leningrad. Currently, it is St. Petersburg. Very large, thoroughly impressive city, commercial center, large population, urban area, incredibly vulnerable. Very little way for the Russian Navy to protect St. Petersburg from a coordinated attack. Weakness number 2 is along the western boundary. Those are open fields. Panzer divisions could roll through them very easily, as they did in the early 1940s. This is an area of grave concern for Russia, and why I've always argued Belarus and Ukraine must be under Russian control for the Russians to have any sense of security vis-a-vis the West. Area number 3, the Caucasus. This is that divide between the Russian Federation, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan. This is a very real area of concern and a very long border to guard. And then finally, we have that stunningly long border with China. China, an economically more impressive country. Very quickly, China is developing a more impressive military on every level except nuclear weapons. And with Chinese demands for energy increasing, you have to think that Beijing is looking northward into Siberia at all of those deposits of natural gas, of oil, and natural resources. This border, however, is far too long for the Russians to effectively guard. These are the 4 weak geostrategic points of the Russian Federation. And then finally, we have the demographic question about Russia. It is absolutely miserable. This is a population that is disappearing. The government has intervened, incentives for people to have more babies. That has had a modest impact, but not nearly enough to avoid the demographic cliff that Russia is facing in this century. For these reasons, Russia does not, in my opinion, pose a growing threat in any way, shape, or form to world politics except through the possession of its nuclear stockpile. Population, as you can see from this graph, clearly in decline. But decline is not good, even for a bitter enemy of the United States. We can establish thresholds for each and every country in the world. The upper threshold is the maximum power that we're comfortable that country having, and then the lower threshold is the minimum power or strength that we are comfortable with. For every country, these thresholds move up and down the power level. For Russia, they're relatively high. But if it is within the upper and lower threshold, that's something that's manageable to us. We can deal with that. Russia today is in the manageable range. If, however, the adversary's strength becomes too high, we have to deal with it. But the good news is we can deal with it. Economic sanctions, military intervention. Saddam Hussein of Iraq became too powerful when he invaded Kuwait. That was not a difficult problem to solve. We weakened him back to a manageable level. The real problem is when the adversary's strength is too low, because there are very few levers at our disposal to deal with an enemy that doesn't have a solid base and begins the process of disintegration. Look at Afghanistan after 2001, Iraq after 2003, Libya after 2011. These were all grave foreign policy miscalculations because our interventions pushed those countries below the lower threshold, and suddenly we have countries that cannot hold themselves together. Imagine if that scenario happened in the Russian Federation, and it almost did in the 1990s. The Russian Federation itself was disintegrating in the aftermath of the Soviet Union falling apart. Unsecured nuclear weapons were a grave concern. There was an ongoing war in Chechnya, a war that the leadership in Moscow may not have even authorized, incompetent leadership at the top, and a number of near-miss second strikes on nuclear policy. On more than one occasion, Boris Yeltsin was approached with the news that the Americans have launched ICBM missiles, nuclear capable, against Russia. What, Mr. President, do you want to do about it? And when you have someone in office who is not mentally stable, who is far too oftentimes hitting the bottle, you do not want that question asked very often. And there he is in 1996 running for re-election. I never understood why the Clinton administration supported Yeltsin's re-election to the point that it did, offering very large IMF loans if and only if Boris Yeltsin is re-elected as president of Russia. because he's an individual that was highly unstable and very difficult to predict. Here he is literally bombing the parliament in Moscow, destroying democracy before our eyes due to his frustration with those policymakers who would not agree with him. Moscow's grip on the country, very high during the old Soviet days, began to decline at the time of Mikhail Gorbachev, reaching a low point in the late 1990s with Yeltsin in power, only rebounding with the arrival of Vladimir Putin. But that low point is literally one of the most dangerous times in all of human history, because we wondered if the Russian Federation was on the cusp of disintegrating itself into a host of different countries, regions, and power centers, potentially with many of them possessing long-range ICBMs with nuclear warheads on them. What is the extent of the Russian threat to global security and the United States? We can place countries on a threat spectrum. In fact, it's not just the country that goes on the spectrum, it's the country's threats individually that go on the spectrum. On the high end are the nuclear weapons of Russia. It has more than we do. It has more than any other country in the world. It has well over half the world's nuclear warheads. That gives it enormous threat capability. But everything beyond that is relatively low range, not overly threatening. We're not intimidated by the Russian army. There's not a lot abroad in terms of forces that the Russians can muster that threaten us, threaten regional stability or our allies. So what are American foreign policy options? Well, it begins with a series of questions. Is a new Cold War with Russia inevitable? Well, the answer here is absolutely not. I understand that we don't like Vladimir Putin. We certainly don't like the way he appears to try to push us and our allies around. That does not mean that an historically cold relationship must exist. Do we share common interest? Absolutely. The Russians are not after global instability. They're after Western disunity. Can we force the Russians into submission so that they'll change policy? No, we can't do that. That's a bridge too far. What should be our priority with the Russian Federation? No doubt about it, it's the nuclear weapons. Returning to the table, negotiating in ways that reflect both Moscow's and Washington's strategic interest to head off arms races happening in Asia and to begin to continue the process of lowering nuclear weapons levels. A soft approach? Well, this is a risk-reward calculation. We've been trying to reset relations with Russia for 30 years. The thinking is that it'll lead to cooperation in critical areas. This is what we learned from Henry Kissinger in the early 70s. This was the underlying feature of détente, which led to great breakthroughs in nuclear arms agreements. It could lead to agreements on regional conflicts and maybe even a new era of détente between the United States and the Russian Federation. This is the reward side of a reset. The dangers, however, are significant because if we try to reset and cooperate, it may send a signal to our allies that we're no longer in it for the whole, we're in it individually. We're going to pursue our own policy with the Russians, and that could cede at least some portion of Europe back to the Russians. So the risk-reward of a soft policy has to be taken into account. Sanctions against Russia, always an option, probably preferred to military engagement. We have to keep in mind, however, that if we sanction Russia for its bad acts, it is going to take that out on our European allies. If we're unhappy with Russian behavior in London, poisoning a dissident, or in destabilizing the Syrian conflict, that we economically sanction it, it means the Germans, the Ukrainians, and the French are all going to pay a higher price tag at the pump because Russia is a main provider of oil, gas, and natural gas to Europe, Central, and West. Cybercrime and election meddling are two of the most frustrating aspects of Russian foreign policy these days. The Russians are hurting us, and they have to pay a price for that. Russian cybercriminal activity is directed at American citizens, the U.S. government, the Defense Department, bringing down public networks that oversee our energy in critical regions of the country. And of course, there is the election meddling. I certainly am not going to contend that Russia has determined the outcome of any American election. I don't think that is the case. But I'm absolutely certain the Russians are trying. I mean, they should try. It's their job as a great power to undermine the well-being of more powerful adversaries. But it doesn't mean we have to accept it. The Russians have an enormous bot army. These are little electronic robots, effectively. They take on the persona of a real person, a teenager from Wisconsin, a construction worker in Florida, or a teacher in California on platforms such as Facebook, Twitter, and the like. And they sow discord. They divide the American public. If there is a school shooting, within minutes, the Russians are on social media posing as Americans and trying to get the debate going about gun control versus the Second Amendment. If there's a riot on the Capitol building, then the Russians are going to be on the social networks trying to stoke the fires of patriotism versus security. And even on issues such as horse paste as an alternative to a COVID vaccine, the Russians are going to be there on social media stoking instability in America's open debate process. So how do we respond to these low-level threats? I think we treat cybercrime and election meddling the same, and probably the bot policy of dividing America a little differently. For cybercrime and election meddling, we're going to make it clear to Russia that they are guilty as alleged. We're not going to go through a legal process with them. We've already decided they've been hacking our elections and they've been undermining our society's confidence in its financial system for far too long. A short-term targeted sanction will be applied and then be lifted at the conclusion of 90, 120, or 180 days. We're making it clear to them there is a price to be paid for their cybercrime, blind eye they're turning, and to their election meddling. And if they come back and hit us again, those sanctions will return for twice as long. This is classic tit-for-tat strategy, which is found to be among the most effective ways for adversaries to interact. You punish the adversary for his bad acts, and then you go back to cooperation until they violate again. You're sending the message that their violations have consequences for them. Their behavior on social media platforms, I would put a lot of pressure on the social media industry. It has prioritized profits over American privacy and profits over American integrity for far too long. There need to be some very serious guardrails established for social media giants so that they can weed out the disinformation, the false information, and the Russian and Chinese propaganda that is flooding Facebook, Twitter, Vine, and all of the other social media platforms. This is widely recognized as a problem, but the American response has been very slow. Thank you, as always, for attending this lecture. Stay engaged and make great decisions.
Hello, everyone. It's my great pleasure as moderator to welcome today's guest discussant, Dr. Henry E. Hale. Dr. Hale is a professor of political science and international affairs at the George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs and co-director of the program on new approaches to research and security in Eurasia. With his doctorate from Harvard, 3 university professorships before his current one, a Fulbright scholarship, and multiple academic awards, Dr. Hale has conducted extensive field research in post-Soviet Eurasia. He is currently working on identity politics and political system change with a special focus on public opinion dynamics in Russia and Ukraine. He has also authored 5 books and has written numerous articles for scholarly journals. Dr. Hale, we're honored that you have accepted our invitation, and we extend to you the very warmest of welcomes. The floor is yours, sir, for your opening remarks.
Sorry, I just had to unmute. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here, and I very much look forward to the discussion afterwards. I think all of us, after witnessing what we've been witnessing over the last 3 weeks, are all struggling to understand it. So you have a lot already to work with in terms of the materials. The video, I think, was quite interesting and impressive, although it didn't mention public opinion at all, whereas the article that you had for today was a lot about public opinion and the role that plays in terms of why Putin is popular at home. So maybe I would just use that as a launching point just to make a few introductory remarks, and then I'm happy to talk about whatever dimension of this, the current events that we're seeing that you'd like to talk about. And I think from my perspective, I see Putin effectively as fighting on 2 fronts, if you might call it that way. First of all, most obviously, he's invaded Ukraine and is taking on the West more generally. But he's also engaged in a conflict with his own people. And it's a question the degree to which he actually has support at home for this. Or not. But I think that what we can say is that he is concerned about making sure that the public either supports what he's doing or at least doesn't raise opposition to it in order to challenge him. Because obviously, if he's removed by people at home, if his regime weakens, then he's lost everything that he is trying to gain here. So I thought maybe I'd just add something to the discussion which wasn't in the article and that I think is sometimes missed or not understood in analysis that I've seen about Putin, and that is how he is actually seen by his own people, in particular how his foreign policy is seen. And this also gets to what Russian people actually want in terms of Russian foreign policy. Of course, this is a complicated question. You can ask surveys in a lot of different ways, and you'll get different kinds of results depending on how you word questions. But one thing that I found pretty consistently in my own research and analyzing public opinion in Russia through surveys conducted by others is that maybe the broad idea is that people perceive. And when I say people in Russia, I mean majorities, right? Because you can find a lot of different views in Russia, like you can find different views here. But broadly speaking, people perceive the West and NATO as a threat, but they want Russia to treat NATO and the West better than they think NATO and the West is treating them. And so if you ask people, for example, how do you think NATO, United States, the West is treating Russia, and you give them the options of as an enemy, as a rival, as an ally, or as a friend, the majority will typically say as a rival, and maybe some would even say as an enemy. Of course, after the invasion, we haven't had a chance to do these polls, so we don't know. But if you ask people how Russia should relate to the West, how Russia should treat the West, the majority has been all throughout the Putin era. The majority have wanted either relations as an ally or even as a friend. The perception advocating friendly relationships, despite everything, is fairly low. At last I saw in December of 2021, that figure was maybe 15%, although throughout most of the Putin era, it was only about kind of 6 to 8%. But the key is that people want a relatively pro-Western foreign orientation for Russia. And interestingly enough, that's actually what they think they're getting in Putin. Because if you ask people, and we've done this many years now, through Russian pollsters, right, who think they're answering and are answering polls from like Russian, polling agencies, right? They're not told that this is something that Western analysts are going to use. They say, like, if you ask Putin, what policy does Putin stand for in relationship to the West? And majorities have consistently said for treating the West as an ally or as a partner. And a few even say they think he advocates friendly relationships with the West. And I don't quite know how to understand that. So they see him basically as somebody who sees the Western threat, but is someone who is a moderate kind of pragmatic guy in the way he's dealing with it, that he's behaving with restraint, that he has a lot of tolerance for what the West is doing, but he's still going to stand up for what's right for Russians, but he's not going to push it too far. So they don't see him as somebody who is hostile to the West. They don't see him as somebody who is lashing out at the West, demanding revenge, threatening punishment, and the like. And kind of along with this, the majority of Russians have generally never favored war. And so, they definitely don't want kind of like, or at least, didn't want, in any kind of general sense, Russia actually to apply military force to deal with its, with the threat they perceive coming from the West. And a related point as well is that, you sometimes hear that Putin needs an enemy and that he stokes threat, or does, tries to stoke up the hostilities with the West because this helps him domestically. Kind of, he can appeal to domestic nationalism and rally around the flag. But this is something else that can be researched through public opinion. And one thing that we find is that there's basically no relationship between rising anti-Americanism and support for Putin. So basically, there's no evidence that he actually gains from this. Whether or not Putin actually believes he doesn't actually seem to benefit from it. And so, I could talk more about that and opinion polls if you like as well. But what I would like to mention is that the current invasion that he launched against Ukraine, does register in opinion polls now as having generated some support. But I think I would note a few things here. One is that since the invasion, the Russian repressive apparatus has cracked down like never before, including really for the first time on even the terminology that you can use in asking survey questions. Before, they never really cared much about that, right? Certainly not in any legal sense. So all that survey agencies can ask now is, do you support the military operation in Ukraine? And even then, you only get about 60% of people supporting it. Even though the propaganda machine is in full force about how this is vitally important. And so you have to figure that figure 60% is already inflated. So I think we can start to see some things there that might lead us to look a little deeper about what's actually going on. And so here I'd just like to say that, kind of comment on that this is very different in terms of the situation that existed around the Crimea annexation, when Russia last deployed its forces outside its border to take and subdue another country's territory, in this case, actually annexing the Crimean Peninsula. And what's different about Crimea is that the public had long supported reunification of Crimea with Russia. They had seen it as a historic Russian territory. Tolstoy wrote about it. And they saw it as something that was worth fighting for, and that was actually Russian land that was illegitimately and arbitrarily given to Ukraine by Nikita Khrushchev in the 1950s. And so there was already a majority of support for Crimea, but there was not support in these same polls before 2014 for taking any other part of Ukraine, and not any other post-Soviet territory as well. But so Crimea was kind of singular. The annexation of Crimea was also bloodless. It was just, they moved some troops around and suddenly Crimea was reunited with Russia at almost no cost in terms of blood. And so what we saw in reaction to Crimea was a genuine outpouring of euphoria. If you look at the press reports, foreign correspondence, anything you could look at in Russia about what was going on immediately after the Crimea annexation, was that this was actually a moment of euphoria among Russians. And I've actually done some research on this and found that it actually led to an increase in birth rate So, there's a research that establishes that, kind of emotions that people feel, especially positive emotions like euphoria, tend to be associated with human fertility. And so you can see this even reflected in kind of a Crimea little baby boomlet that took place in Russia. And I think that kind of adds to the credibility of the polls and other analysis showing that this really was an unusual moment. And this euphoria, I think, was what sort of anchored Putin's support among the population for like 4 years after 2014. But this time is very, very different. First of all, there's a lot of death and violence involved. And so this is not, the public support that you see registered in the polls is not about euphoria. You listen to what, kind of people say about it, to the extent that there is public support that comes out in forms of statements that people talk about. It's not about like, hooray, we've had this great victory. It's about duty, and it's about threat, and it's about death. So these are kind of negative type emotions that can lead to a rallying around the leader, but not of the same kind as kind of a euphoric victory that can lead. And there was little actual support for military intervention in Ukraine among the broader public right on the eve of the war. I was one of the commissioners of a survey done in Russia as late as December of this past year, 2021. And it asked people what policy they thought Russia should undertake with respect to Ukraine and the conflict that's playing out in the Donbass. And only 8% said that they thought that Russia should send troops to Ukraine to fight the Kiev government. And again, this is quite remarkable if we think that this was actually what the Putin government was already planning to do, that they could only generate through their propaganda apparatus, only 8% of people willing to prefer that option as opposed to the other options, which included things like humanitarian aid or diplomatic efforts. So I think what this tells us is that basically for Putin to have the people genuinely on his side in this conflict, the Russian people, I mean, he basically has to completely deceive them about what's actually going on. And that's what happened, right? The way that he reacted to his own people when he was talking to them about, and what his own media, how his own media covered Western warnings that Russia was about to invade Ukraine, right? That was one of the Obama administration strategies, was to kind of basically expose this every point of every moment of the way that, look, they're going to invade soon. Turns out that was right. So how did the Russian media portray this in Russia? They portrayed this as hysterical. There's no threat. We're not going to invade. Russia's foreign minister said, no, nobody's talking about an invasion. We're not going to invade. And even now, they don't call it an invasion. And in fact, it's illegal, punishable by prison on treason charges to say that this is an invasion or even to call it war. So basically, in order to get the public to support it, they're clearly very worried that you have to basically convince people that what's going on is not even close to what it actually is. And so if you look at how the Russian media is selling this to the Russian public, first of all, as I mentioned, right, they say, well, it's not an invasion, it's not a war, it's a quote unquote military operation designed to take out very kind of micro-targeted elements that are Nazis that are controlling Ukraine supposedly, which again is a ridiculous claim just on its face. I mean, I could go on for hours about that, but just the most obvious fact about that is that Ukraine's leader is Jewish. It's very hard to call him a Nazi. The coverage is that in fact it's the Kiev government that is launching the assault by attacking the territories that Russia already controlled, which Russia portrays as independent states that are kind of expressions of the will of their people. So Russia portrays this as a genocide against them. And they also very critically, the Russian media are, I think, paying a lot of attention, and this is really important for the support that Putin wants to get at home, is they are kind of inoculating or trying to inoculate public opinion against actually learning the truth and seeing other sources of information. So extensive reports and argument, basically claims that the standard operating tactic of the quote unquote Nazis in Ukraine is to use civilians as human shields. So any report that reaches Russians about civilian deaths, the hospital in Mariupol, the theater, the children's carriages that you might have seen images of lined up in Lviv. Well, that's only because the enemy is using them as human shields, and they fire weapons from there, draw return fire, and we Russians are trying very hard to avoid that. And in general, we're successful, but occasionally, maybe there's something wrong. So even if reports get back about what's happening, they're priming people not to believe it. They show reports on Russian TV about how Ukrainian secret police are supposedly forcing ordinary people in Ukraine, to use social media to kind of quote unquote falsely say that Russian bombs are killing them or hitting their villages. So what that's basically telling Russians is that, well, okay, you might be hearing on social media from your friends and relatives there that something bad is happening, but it's just, don't worry about it. They're just being forced to say it, right? And they're actually under grave threat. And this is why we need actually to intervene. So this, I think, helps explain partly why you hear these reports of, like a Russian in Kharkiv saying, Mom, my building is being shelled by Russian troops, tell them to stop. And the mother says, no, you're just under the influence of Nazi propaganda. Don't worry, we're coming to rescue you. Putin also uses the line that the Americans, the West, would have imposed sanctions on Russia anyway, because the West just wants to keep Russia down. So, you might feel bad now, you might suffer economically, but that was going to happen anyway. Better now that we're standing up for you than just to sit back and take it. And the media is also just using kind of what I would call a spaghetti at the wall type treatment for finding different ways to justify very serious intervention. Threat of nuclear, that like Ukraine might get nuclear weapons, that the United States is preparing chemical weapons. I mean, there is reporting I saw on Russian TV that United States and Ukraine were developing bioweapons that would be spread by migrating birds that winter in Ukraine and are now going to be flying back to Russia for the summer and spreading disease, and drones that would release mosquitoes that carry disease into Russia. So this is all what's being kind of fed to Russians to not believe the truth and to think that something different is happening than it is. And so I think just the final point is that the problem for Putin is eventually information is going to get out. Sons, daughters, people in the military are not going to come home, from serving in the military. The economic hardships are going to hit, and even if they don't initially blame Putin for it, for all these reasons, right? Even if they buy propaganda, in general, negative sentiments, right, don't work well for whoever is in power. And it's going to be very hard for Putin to recreate any kind of positivity. He's certainly not able to do it in the way that it happened in Crimea. And I think the bigger point behind this is that, to me, partly what this says is this was Putin's decision. This was not a domestic politics driven decision. It's not an attempt to certainly not a reflection of any Russian nationalism, which was not really, certainly in its majority form, was not desirous of any kind of aggression like this. Maybe Putin thought he could generate a rally around the flag effect that would work to his advantage, and maybe that's because he mistakenly thought that Ukraine would crumble. But I think it comes back down to, we have to think about what Putin's mentality is. His political system gives him a lot of power. Public opinion can be a constraint, but it also means that he can disregard it when he wants to. I think that, he thinks in this case that this is too important for him. We could talk about why later if you'd like. and that he's going to try to manage the public opinion situation so that he doesn't face a threat from it. And so you're seeing this heavy propaganda effort aimed at domestic Russian public opinion at the same time as a massive crackdown on opposition, trying to really intimidate people from speaking out. So I think this is how kind of that second domestic front of Putin's operations are playing out. So I better stop there. I've gone on much longer than I intended to go, but I'm really happy to talk. I mean, happy isn't a good word these days, but I'll be glad to talk with you about any of this and look forward to hearing your thoughts and insights as well as part of the discussion. So thank you.
Thank you, Professor. We really appreciate your opening remarks. And I sit here, I'll claim the privilege, if I may, of asking the first question, but I'm sitting here struck dumb by the 8% figure that you mentioned, that only 8% of the populace wish to warmonger and perhaps attack Ukraine, and the rest of the people didn't. And thereafter, this incredible disinformation mind warp that is now occurring in Russia. I mean, the control over the media, the control over the internet, and the control over the minds of the population. I mean, certainly some information, as I understand it, is still getting through on these VPN networks and Telegram and these other things that the Russians can't control. I mean, is the Russian populace so benighted that it can't figure out that a lot of this is hooey and makes no sense? And if they do, and ultimately most of them didn't want to invade, and the body bags start coming back, do you see this as a potential for real trouble for Mr. Putin?
Yeah, I do see it as a big potential threat for him, and I think that's one reason why he's so concerned about it. Right? It's not like this is just being ignored in the media. I mean, he's paying intense attention to managing public opinion, and so yeah, I would say I think information is bound to get out. Right? Either when people die there and don't return home. People are very connected in Russia to extended networks of family and friends on whom they traditionally rely, very strong kind of bonds like that. So you're going to hear throughout those networks, what actually happens in many ways, plus the economic suffering. Plus there's a lot of connections between Russians in Russia and Ukrainians, right? I mean, they were part of the same country in the USSR for years, a lot of intermarriage, a lot of people have relationships from work or past work, all kinds of connections. And, so information is going to spread for sure, and some will kind of resist the truth, right? But, there are going to be those that believe it. And then, there are two questions beyond that, right? And that, or maybe it's really one question, and that's just like, well, what are you going to do about it? And the bottom line problem is that you face a massive, what political science would call a collective action problem, which is basically the problem that, like, if you yourself, like, say you have a majority that oppose the war, but you're the only one willing to go out on a limb and oppose it, right? You're just going to be taken out by the regime, and then you've lost everything, whereas everybody else kind of gets to at least, keep their jobs within Russia. So what you really have to do in order to speak out is be confident that there are, in fact, a majority of others that don't support the war and, in fact, oppose it enough to risk their livelihoods to do so. And then, actually to be willing to take those risks, right? Which not everybody is, right? Not everybody kind of is a protester type person or feels that strongly enough about it to take those risks. And when communication channels are blocked like this in Russia, it makes it very difficult for people to have the confidence that enough other people are going to join you in any kind of support, that it's worth taking that risk. And that's what, like, these symbols like the Z military operate, that people kind of wear on their chest, these big, you mentioned these big demonstrations of support in the stadium, with people clearly kind of mobilized by the government. I mean, that's a very common tactic, even though I haven't seen this particular episode. That's how they generate the appearance of public support. And that's part of what the appearance of support does, is it convinces, or it tries to convince people that, well, even if you don't like it, there are not enough other people like you to make it worth your while even bothering reaching out, especially when the cost could be so high. You face a treason charge. So, what happens is that you have a lot of people just kind of hiding their preferences, right? Some will speak out anyway, consequences be damned. And, you see a lot of people doing that, or a lot of people are leaving, but some will stay back and just not state their opposition to the war. And that kind of silence can let this situation continue for a very long time. But then I think one thing that history does teach us, like if we look all the way back to like either 1989, the fall of communism, or the Arab Spring, where you had highly repressive regimes, but that, there was no room for public opinion, but where it was pretty clear that the regimes did not have legitimacy. There was a lot of seething opposition within. And despite the repressive apparatus, you get kind of a random event or something that just like triggers it, right? And suddenly the whole thing collapses. And in the Arab Spring, it was a Tunisian fruit vendor who set himself on fire, and for some reason that caught the moment and just like triggered everybody to, one after the other, to start coming out into the streets. As more people saw other people coming out there, they said, okay, well, I'm going to go out there too now. And before you knew it, you have thousands and hundreds of thousands of people out in the street across the Arab world, and some regimes collapsed. Something similar happening in Eastern Europe under communism as well. And so I think that's something that could happen with Putin. The difficulty is for us looking on the outside is we have no idea when that moment is going to come. It could come very soon, and I think the higher the casualty rate is that Russia suffers, the more likely it is to happen sooner rather than later. Whereas otherwise, it could be something that Putin could hang on for another 10 years, something like that.
My God, what a horrible prospect.
Yeah.
Beyond the body bags coming back, it's just, I would think any intelligent Russian looking at this and just seeing the wanton, bestial destruction and death that they're wreaking upon Ukraine to no good end. I mean, I can barely watch the evening news anymore. It's just, you sit here and you feel such a deep sense of anger, and at the same time such a deep sense of impotence that we're not able to stop this. I mean, it's an abattoir that we're looking at here, and the bold-faced lies that the Russian government puts forward. These are Ukrainians killing themselves, or this or that, making up all these things. It's really quite beyond belief. I'm sorry, I'm hyperventilating here, but I've just been internalizing this so much over the last 3 weeks. Whenever I hear the words Russia or Russian, I think immediately of masochism and misery. And it almost puts me in mind of the old phrase from one of the Gershwin songs, "I found more skies of gray than any Russian play could guarantee." I mean, it just seems, it's just this grayness that goes on forever that we never seem to emerge from. Well, I've had my say. Adrian, is there anyone else online that would like to pose a question to the professor?
Yeah, we've got some people. The first question is from Larry. He says, looking back over the last decade or more, what U.S. or NATO behaviors were perceived as threatening by the Russian public rather than as something more productive?
Yeah, well, I think that the threat perception comes from a number of things. I mean, partly there's the to some degree it's the legacy of the Cold War. Because even in the early 1990s, you could still find a substantial share of Russians that thought that Western economic advice was actually designed to undermine Russia's economy. And one of the reasons that was the case was because Russia underwent a economic collapse after communism, and so a lot of people think that like you can make a legitimate case that a lot of the Western advice was misguided, but just because it didn't work or was kind of mistaken. And that's even if you believe that the Russian government really, took that advice fully. I mean, they take responsibility for what they do, and they did a lot of it on their own. But from the population's perspective, it's kind of, they see all these Western advisors coming in, and they see their economy collapsing, and they themselves suffered greatly during that period. And so I think that, a lot of people just put two and two together and said, okay, well, this is just like the West trying to keep us down. So that might not have been kind of a majority at first, but over time that played into it. And then, NATO and, the way I've seen it described is it's not so much NATO expansion as in terms of the number of countries and the territory, but it's the combination of that with the expansion of NATO's mission that a lot of people in Russia found like genuinely threatening, in the sense that, it wasn't just that NATO started to include, countries closer and closer to Russia, but it was the bombing of Serbia over Kosovo, which resounded very negatively in Russia already in the 1990s, like right before Putin was around and before you had strict, strong government control over mass media. I mean, during the Yeltsin era, when that was going on, different oligarchs, controlled Russia's media. And they, they were like regular media. They kind of go after the audience. And what resonated in Russia, what were scenes of ordinary Serbs suffering. And so that was what was shown on TV. And it was shown that this was basically kind of, NATO countries doing this. And so it was this idea of sort of expanded missions for NATO. And then I think the article mentioned Libya, in 2011 played a role. And so, again, I mean, I think it also, to me, it strains credulity to think that people really believe that NATO could be directed against Russia. But from a lot of Russia's perspective, they kind of saw, okay, well, there's this alliance that was supposed to be about the Cold War. We got rid of the communist regime that was supposedly the enemy. So why is this still there? Why is it becoming more active than not? And why is it moving closer to our borders? So, I think like these are all things that then a lot of Russian politicians played up on, right? And they played to their base, and it resonated with the economic grievance that they felt, just the aggravation of being in a massive depression during most of the 1990s. It was very easy to kind of blame the West and NATO for all these things. It's kind of as the more powerful international actor, it's kind of an object of blame for politicians that want to escape their own blame, right? And so they kind of divert blame there. And so I think that's a lot of what was going on, and a lot of what Putin and others really tried to tap into, at least certainly the last 10, 15 years.
Adrienne, anyone else with a question?
Yeah, quite a few. The next one is Irene. She has her hand raised. Irene, do you want to unmute yourself?
This is Irene's husband, Chris.
Oh, sorry.
So no problem at all. I was wondering if you would briefly like to talk about how the Russian military has kind of descended into sort of like this Russian nationalism that has gotten this theory about a mystic Russian Orthodox civilization that is under constant threat from this secular West intent on destroying it. I've been reading Russian military documents for quite a long time, and I've been really kind of shocked by this sort of like bizarre, almost mystical thinking about what they have. You were talking about, for instance, the revolution in Tunisia. They call it the color revolutions, and all activities like that are always caused by the external evil West. So I was wondering if you'd like to discuss that and briefly talk about how it's become rather almost mystical in their thinking. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, really interesting question. I mean, yeah, and certainly, over the recent years, Russia's official military and security doctrines have come to, portray these quote unquote color revolutions as one of the primary threats that Russia faces. I don't have a explanation for why you get this kind of, as you put it, mystical kind of turn in the way that the military has kind of conceptualized things in Russia, at least a lot of them. But I think it is rooted in to some degree, the people in power have always tried to embrace the Russian Orthodox Church as a way of legitimating their own rule, right? I mean, it was harder, during the communist period, there was official ideology, right, which was, against any, religion formally, although the church was allowed to exist and there was some collaboration between the church leaders and the regime. Then when Yeltsin came to power, he had long been a communist himself. And so, he kind of only with some difficulty in the 1990s was able to sort of try and invoke the church and its principles. I mean, he'd appear at holidays. I mean, I saw him personally once at one Orthodox Easter, appearing there at the church. So he would flirt with that. But Putin did this much more openly when he came to power. And even though he didn't make this really a central part of his public appeal, right? Like he wasn't kind of out front about religiosity. After facing very big protests that were mentioned in the article in 2011 and 2012, which coincided with slipping popularity on the part of Putin. And I think that illustrates kind of, back why he cares so much about public opinion, because like when legitimate support goes down, the protest potential goes up. And the way that he reacted that time was in part to invoke this, what's been called a conservative turn by analysts. And that basically means that he started to invoke all of these kind of traditional values and, the themes that were, that we might characterize as conservative. And so, that included things like, anti-LGBTQ plus rhetoric, right? The anti-gay laws. And part of this was also a tighter embrace of the church. And so, that was the article mentioned, like Pussy Riot affair, which was partly about, this group of people that were portrayed as these corrupt Westerners who, did something blasphemous in a church. And, it seems that that's kind of where a lot of this has come from. And then, I think kind of maybe my final point here would just be that, the Kremlin's relationship with ideology is really interesting and complex. My colleague, Professor Marlène Laruelle at George Washington University also has written about this and described the Kremlin's relationship with ideology as cultivating a whole set of different ideological ecosystems where you have different think tanks and different thinkers funded by different oligarchs, all kind of developing their own version of kind of pro-Kremlin ideologies. And some of these are kind of liberal, kind of interpretations of support for Putin that play on kind of things that he did are more kind of pro-market, flat tax, that kind of thing. Whereas others are conservative and religious. And there's a set of oligarchs in particular that, including some ones very close to Putin, like Yakunin, for example, who used to, anyway, I won't go into the details, but basically, he funded a lot of, religious, themed, kind of ideological production, if you want to call it that. And, it had the military component, and it had, kind of the Russian state as the protector of orthodoxy, kind of Moscow as the third Rome, that kind of thing. And more recently, the church seems to have bought into it, right? Like Sergei Shoigu, which is interesting because he hails from Tuva, an ethnic minority that's kind of historically shamanist. But at the same time, it's under his watch that you see the military building like this big cathedral, kind of this military cathedral, that really blends these themes. So, that I don't have any clear explanation for it, except that it's a way of the Kremlin of kind of melding these different themes that it thinks are ultimately, going to support its legitimacy, and also, make the military hard to criticize if it's bound up with kind of a religious cause.
Okay, thank you.
Thorough answer. Adrian, who's next?
Oh, Esther, she asked, what was the Russian populace's perspective on the annexation of Belarus?
Belarus hasn't been actually annexed, but the Russian and I guess if the question is, would people support that? I haven't seen a question that like directly posed that question, but what I have seen is, for example, polls that ask about which territories are Russian land. And majority would have replied Crimea among those. Belarus was only kind of a minority response. If you ask people in Russia, if you did before the invasion, in the ideal world, what would the boundaries of Russia be, right? Which is a very kind of almost a leading question, because it leaves out the question of how the borders would change, right? And a lot of people would not support forcibly changing those borders. But you could find pretty consistently, before the Crimea annexation through 2019 was the last time I saw these figures, that about 20% of the population would think that, well, the borders should ideally be those of the Soviet Union. And another 20% roughly that would say that ideally these borders should be those of the Slavic republics of the former USSR, which would include Ukraine and Russia. So, you could figure that if you put those two together, maybe 40% might, in the abstract, support the idea of incorporating Belarus and Russia. And Yeltsin and Putin at different times have kind of called for reunification, and it's been the Belarusian president in part who has actually resisted that at different times, even though rhetorically he's kind of been pro-Russian pretty consistently. So, there is some support for that, I think, in the abstract, but it's even that was not nearly as much as support for Crimea. And I think that's because of the unique place that people think Crimea had in Russian history, and plus the notion that the majority of Crimea's population were actually Russians by nationality, which is not the case even in Belarus.
Okay, thank you. The next question is from Al. He says, or he asks, what would the Russian public have said if the Ukraine invasion had succeeded in 2 weeks?
Well, I think that's a good question. I think if it had succeeded in 2 days, it might have been, it would have been something that would be a little more popular, but it depends on what the end game would have been. And, would it have been just my guess is that if it had succeeded, if basically Russia had gotten control of Ukraine, I don't think they would have annexed it. I think they would have been to install a quote unquote pro-Russian government there. And actually, I think they would have concretely tried to restore, quote unquote, restore the government that was overthrown in the 2014 Orange Revolution, because the Kremlin's narrative had been all about how the Kiev government is just a group of Nazis that illegally seized power then. So kind of to restore that would have been more consistent with the propaganda line that Putin had been putting out there. And so I think that had that happened, and had it been relatively costless, this probably would have been seen by a majority as some kind of success. But by the same token, even that would have led to a lot of that would have led to massive sanctions, which I think in the longer term would hurt Putin's popularity quite substantially. But I don't think even that would have generated the kind of euphoria that you saw with Crimea at all. I think it might have generated some support that would be much more likely to fade much quicker. And so I think even by 2 weeks, had this succeeded in 2 weeks rather than in 2 days, that only means it's more and more costly, and that more carnage has been wrought on Ukraine and for Russians themselves, right? Russians have died. So I think that still would bode ill for Putin in the longer run. So I think kind of what I've said from the beginning is I would expect like an operation like this. Typically, at the very outset, there's rallying around the flag, both because the regime has, whoever's in power, even in democracies, this happens, right? Even where democracies are wrong, you typically see, kind of rallying around the flag in the face of conflict, because people don't want to go against their leader, when there's war at stake. And the leader usually has the advantage, at least initially, of selling their logic to the public. But then there's typically a sobering up, which happens. Sometimes it can take a long time. In democracies, it doesn't take very long at all. Bush after the Bush won after the Gulf War. I mean, his ratings were like 80% right afterwards, and that's why a lot of Democratic challengers, heavyweights, got out of the presidential race, and people like Bill Clinton, who weren't that well known, stayed in. But then his popularity tanked very quickly after that, which kind of made him a right target for the Democratic nominee. So Putin has more tools in his arsenal, but I think still you're going to get this sobering up, especially since the effects are mainly going to be kind of a negativity that people feel rather than the euphoria that came with Crimea.
Okay, thank you. The next one is from Esther. Has non-Russian print, audio, and visual media been completely cut off within Russia's borders?
For the most part, yes. It's not completely cut off because through the VPNs, the virtual private networks, it's still possible to at least use some of them in Russia to access Western media coverage. You can still spread a lot of stuff informally, right? People send reports and videos and things like that. There are ways that people can kind of, get some information like that. But for the most part, it's been pretty walled off now.
Okay, the next one is from Yolanda. How reliable are the polls and surveys in Russia? For example, the survey of only 8% approving of the invasion.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I make like a couple points there. One is we always have to be cautious about opinion polls in Russia. But then when we think about whether or how they might be off, we need to think about also the direction in which they would be off. And so I think that for only 8% to support moving troops into Ukraine, just less than a couple months before their government actually does this, is quite surprising, right? I think that if the idea were that Russia were priming the people to support something like this, and if that were the message they were getting on media about what the government wanted to hear people say, then you would have seen a much, much higher number. So I think, this I think indicates that, some of these polling results are actually quite sincere. Now, however, what I think kind of the polling results that go in the opposite direction that, so I think that's the key is kind of the bias is likely to go in the direction that we think that people are likely to think the Kremlin wants to hear. And so that's why I think results about the level of Putin's support and, the level of support for the quote unquote military operation are likely inflated. We do have some ways of actually assessing that. I mean, as social scientists, there's a lot of attention to trying to figure out, whether even the polling before all this happened, right? Is Putin really popular? Kind of the birth rates evidence to me is indication, one indication that people really did support the annexation of Crimea, but there are other ways as well. So for example, in trying to assess the degree to which Putin is actually popular, one group of researchers, and I've done some experiments like this as well, is when you do an opinion poll, you kind of hide the question in another question. And so what you might do, for example, is you ask people, okay, I'm going to give you a list of leaders, and how many of them do you generally approve of, right? So maybe you give them 4 leaders, right? And they're like leaders from history or something like that, right? It could be, Stalin, Khrushchev, Lenin, Nikolai the First, something like that, right? But then you randomly divide the poll respondents in half and give one half an additional leader, which is Putin. And so if you ask them the same question, how many of these leaders do you support? And the only difference between the people who got the extra leader, Putin, and the people that were not asked about Putin at all is just that they were randomly chosen. then if you see a difference in the number of people, in the number of leaders that people said they support among the set that got Putin, then that's going to give you a measure of how many people actually support him, even though you never, any one person in that poll, if you ask, all they give is like a number, right? Like you ask them, how many do you support? Well, okay, I support 3 of them. Nobody after the fact can ever go back and say, okay, well, this person in the poll supported Putin, because you don't know which of the 3. The person, you go back and ask them and they'll say, okay, well, yeah, my 3 were Lenin, Stalin, and Nikolai I. You never know, but by randomization, right, kind of, it's like an experimental treatment. You can get estimates of this, and the results of these have indicated, in fact, that for the most part, ordinary polls about Putin's support were not wrong. The exception, though, I think what was, in fact, after Crimea, and so this is where I did some research on this as well. And, my research found that while there was a bump in support for Putin that came after the Crimea annexation, actually about 3/4 of the new supporters that Putin got as registered in opinion polls were in fact kind of faking their answers. So there was a bump in Putin support, but it was not nearly as great as was reflected in the opinion polls. So the message here is we have to take opinion polls definitely with a big grain of salt, but we don't have to stop there. We can look at different ways of trying to triangulate and figure out what the truth is. And so, that's my reflection that, on how, we can try to do that in a situation like this.
Okay, thank you. The next thing we've got in chat is a comment from Mike from something earlier in the discussion. Many Russians and Ukrainians in the US and elsewhere can still communicate with families still in Russia, and the video of bombed buildings is impossible to deny.
Yeah, and I think the video is impossible to deny, although, some of the Russian media would try to argue that these are kind of like deep fakes, kind of computer generated. But actually, I haven't really seen that argument on Russian TV the times I've tried to, watch it. Instead, I think what the Kremlin tries to do is to say, okay, well, these pictures are genuine, like they're actual pictures, but they are either, first of all, staged somehow, stage managed. So like the Mariupol hospital bombing, I mean, that was all shown, right? All the same images that we saw in the West, the woman being carried out from the rubble, the young woman. But kind of in that instance, like, I saw in one Russian news segment, extensive coverage of that. And, they just found all kinds of ways to try to discredit it, by, basically making different kinds of accusations and, saying, okay, well, I noticed there's this kind of weird scene in the corner of that photo. Like, why would this be here if this were real bombing? The toys were strewn in a strange way, right? Things that try to make people think that critically thinking people would not really buy this. And they kind of almost ridicule the idea that anybody would think that these videos actually reflect Russian, carnage inflicted by Russia, or at least inflicted by Russia intentionally. And the other way that they try to deal with this is by blame attribution, right? Exactly, to say that this bomb building, that was done by Ukrainian forces in order to blame Russia for it. Of course, that's the way it is, right? And so, they employ all these strategies to try to get people basically not to believe their own eyes. But I have to agree with the premise of the question that over time it just strains too much credibility to think that people are actually going to buy this. The Russian population, there are a lot of people that are just kind of buy whatever Putin says, but a lot of them are very critically thinking people. If anything, Russians are known for their cynicism about official narratives and official TV. So my guess is that a lot of this in the end is going to be kind of just too much to deny.
Okay, then Mike comments, the answer to state propaganda there is not state censorship here. Promoting anti-First Amendment policies here is wrong.
Yeah, I mean, if I'm asked to comment on that, yeah, I mean, I think we have to, protect First Amendment rights, certainly.
Right.
I mean, for everything, there are certain limits, but, in this case, I think we have to allow freedom of speech.
Right. Okay. And then from Bill, we have, can you speak to the Russian standard of living and how will sanctions impact it? And could the result in Putin being pushed from office? And could this result in Putin being pushed from office?
My guess is, that the standard of living change alone having an effect would probably be, a longer term type effect. My guess is that like the shorter term effect, if there is one, is going to come primarily from, the casualties inflicted by Ukrainian forces on the Russian military and, possibly just the military failure there, to the extent that happens. But, the economic question is certainly very important and certainly would play into that, just in its own right. I mean, Russian standard of living has risen dramatically up until now, at least, compared with what it was like, certainly in the Soviet period, and definitely from the 1990s as well. I mean, under Putin, even before all this, right, I think you could probably make a pretty good argument that Russians have never lived better materially than, ever than they were under Putin, in the last decade. And, I visited Russia a lot. I traveled lots of places, well outside Moscow. Just tremendous change in the quality of life of ordinary people, which just doesn't mean there aren't some that are left behind. But, on the whole, it's been a dramatic improvement. And Russians obviously like that. And part of what they have liked, broadly speaking, is the fact that they have kind of risen up in the world, including in the world economy, and they could take advantage of a lot of things that people who have resources can do in the world economy. I mean, not just oligarchs, but kind of ordinary people. They could travel and go on vacation to lots of places, buy Western goods, save up, and do things. Send their kids abroad to go to school. All those different kinds of things, and that's what the sanctions are really shutting down. And economy is going to falter, and I think people do. People can be convinced, a good number of people can be convinced for at least a short period of time that, well, maybe this wasn't really Russia's fault. At least that's kind of, I think, what happened after Crimea. But they're not going to be happy with it. And I think, again, once the sobering up period comes, which I think probably won't be too long, they're going to start to think, well, was it really necessary to get us into all this? Putin says that we would have been sanctioned inevitably, but is that really the case? Why would this actually doesn't make any sense? So I think there are going to be a lot of people that are very unhappy with it. I mean, we've already seen tens of thousands of people leave Russia already, right? Big brain drain happening as we speak, and I think that sentiment will certainly only grow as the consequences of the sanctions grow over time, and as people kind of stop to think about this and really kind of realize that what they've lost and that what they've lost seems to be long term, unless some big change at the top happens.
Okay, thank you. Bill asked, several commentators have described Putin as mentally and emotionally unstable. What is the chance he will feel cornered and use tactical nuclear weapons?
That's a big question. My hope is that he's not completely lost it, or at least that the people around him haven't also lost it, right? So just because he orders it doesn't mean that somebody around him, especially if they see that he is not in full faculties, that's the kind of thing maybe somebody would refuse to actually, push that button, to use the metaphor. So that's a hope, but it's a risk, right? You see somebody like Putin doing things that are clearly outside of what we would call rationality. You have to question the possibility that something like that could happen, or that something there could be some kind of misunderstanding when he's not like, when he's in a certain aggrieved military mental state. I guess I tend to think, that there is a certain logic to what he's doing, in terms of that kind of fits in with a certain worldview that he has. It's sort of an extreme reaction on that, kind of in the extreme end of all that. But I don't see clear signs that he's just gone so completely nuts that he would destroy the world. But we have to be careful about that, right? And we have to be careful also about the possibility of misunderstandings, miscommunications that, could, in a situation that he's already put us in, lead us down a road that nobody wants to go.
Professor, that having been said, there are nuclear weapons and there are nuclear weapons. What about tactical nuclear weapons? And there, Russia has quite a inventory advantage over the U.S. I think there's something like 2,000 tactical nuclear weapons in Russia, and we have about 230 in our arsenal. I was reading the other day that Matthew Koenig from the Atlantic Council actually said that I find it hard to imagine Putin accepting a complete military defeat without him trying to use nuclear weapons first. If he were to use tactical nuclear weapons, say to take out a small town or just to do a display, to escalate, maybe to try then to de-escalate. Could you see him doing something like that?
Well, I think, something. Yeah, I think, my specialty is not the Russian military, but, my understanding of, kind of Russian military thinking and military doctrine is that, it's on the table, right? Like the tactical nuclear weapons. And, if there was a perceived threat, dire enough to Russia itself that it could be used. And so, it's possible that he could, Putin, frame a situation such that, a desperate measure would need to be taken. But it's hard for me to think of, exactly how and where a weapon like that would be deployed in a way that wouldn't backfire, and that, both domestically in terms of Russian public opinion, and also backfire in terms of the goals that he wants to achieve. So, without them and the people around him actually understanding that this is likely to backfire. So, again, I can't rule it out. I think it's a possibility we have to consider, but I don't see an obvious scenario in which that would be a likely outcome at this point. But again, you get people, if they get cornered into a desperate position, we can't rule it out. And so, there are a lot of other questions this kind of brings up, but maybe I'll just stop there and follow up on anything that people want to talk about more. Well,
Putin and his coterie seem to be pretty bad at misjudging backfires, because they have the Ukrainians fighting back tooth and nail.
Yeah.
NATO and the U.S. united as we've never been. These people just don't seem to be able to get it right, and they're not moving their military the way they thought they would. So God only knows the way it'll play out. You're quite right. Adrian, who's up next?
Richard has his hand up. Do you want to unmute yourself, Richard?
Yes, thank you. I have two questions. One is, what happened to the Voice of America, and is it technically recreatable? The other is that I've heard some friends that seem to have some understanding, kind of like what you have, which is in depth, that there's a river running through the Ukraine that might be a reasonable boundary line if Russia was willing to actually negotiate with the Ukraine. And I think someone else has asked that as well. If you could comment on those two things, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, my understanding about Voice of America is that, it still exists and operates, but just entirely on an online format. So I think like you can't do reporting there now, but my recollection is that it's still there. I mean, I was recently invited for an interview by the Voice of America based in Azerbaijan, interestingly enough. So I think it's my sense is it's there. It just doesn't have operations in Russia. I don't know if it kind of actually does sort of analog transmission anymore, whether it's just all by the internet. But that's an interesting question. I should try to find that out. So on the question of natural geographic boundaries and rivers, I mean, I think the big issue is that I just don't see Ukrainians themselves as being in any mood to negotiate along any lines like that. Maybe you could find some territories that Russia could stop at, just take maybe half the country, or maybe it wouldn't even be at a river, but maybe they'd take kind of like shoreline or something like that. But my understanding of what the kinds of proposals are that have been voiced for possible ceasefires is that it's not really about the natural boundaries. It's more just about like what Russia actually de facto controls now on the ground, and kind of how far back that would be. That would need to be kind of rolled back, or how much they could hold up. So I guess it's possible, right? The military, if they do just kind of lay waste to much of Ukraine, move all the way to like the Dnieper River, which may be the one that you're talking about. I mean, maybe they would stop there. But I don't know if I see that as any more likely than any other, outcome in that kind of situation. More likely it'll be kind of they either kind of keep trying to go or seize certain cities, or I think if there were one part of Ukraine that they would try to lop off or separate in addition to what they already control, it would be the Black Sea coastline is my guess. And again, it might be hard to defend in a lot of ways because, right, there's not a river that would kind of nicely separate you from there. But these days, I mean, with artillery and everything like that, I don't know if those boundaries matter as much as they used to.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Adrian?
Yeah, the next question is from Mike. He says, if Putin has an accident, in quotes, what do you think would happen? Who would take over?
Well, I mean, that's a big question as well. And, so my guess is that, if, you had an accident like this of some sort, it'd probably set off a kind of a power struggle in Russia. I mean, it has a line of succession. Basically you're talking kind of like in the United States, there's no vice president in Russia, but you do have a head of a lower house of Congress and the head of the Senate. And so, those would be the next figures that would be in line, and they're both kind of clear Putinites who are clearly, part of this whole decision. So I guess if I were to really spin out a scenario, I could see if something like that happens, maybe one of them trying to walk this back and trying to say, okay, well, this was a disaster. It's Putin's fault. Russian leaders are usually very good at blaming their past dead predecessors for all ills. At least during the communist period, that's what we saw regularly. Even though those leaders often were the ones that had brought them up. And so, my guess is you'd probably see something like that. But none of those leaders have any of the kind of support that Putin has, even with kind of pumped up results in opinion polls. So my guess is that this would be a great period of uncertainty in Russia. I mean, well, anyway, yeah, there's a lot of possibilities there, but that would be my, I guess, kind of my first cut at an answer.
Okay.
If Putin makes it all the way through this war and comes out smelling like a rose, do you see him trying to stay on until 2036, the way he's jiggered the Constitution now?
I think the easiest answer is yes, just because he went out of his way to extend the formal constitutional term limit to allow him to do so, should he be able to quote unquote win elections. At the same time, who knows, if he's getting older, right? And he might be thinking about trying to find some way to protect his and his family's interests for the long run, in which case, if you do think about that, then, maybe you try to organize some sort of succession plan that puts somebody in power that you trust. And, maybe that happens before 2036. I don't entirely rule out that could even happen in 2024. I mean, at least, it's one possibility is that he wanted to get this taken care of, kind of unite Ukraine and kind of hand his successor this kind of new Russian empire. And then he could kind of be in the background enforcing it all as kind of the next generation takes over. I mean, I wouldn't say that I wouldn't stand by that for sure, but I don't think we can entirely rule that out. But, he'll be, sort of, 70 very soon. By 2036, like he'll be over 80. Who knows? I think he's got to be thinking about this for the longer term, just to protect his own family and friends' interests. So if I had to bet, I would bet he's there until 2036 or something happens to him. What I mean is, if this is his own intent, right? His intent is to stay into 2036. I would guess that's probably his intent. But I do think there are other possibilities that, if I were in government or like the, intelligence agencies, I would be kind of gaming out these different possibilities as well, because we can't entirely rule them out. He's surprised us before.
Well, if he can still ride a barebacked and bare-chested, who knows?
Well, exactly. That's exactly the point of doing all that. I think it's, it's to show how healthy he is, on his...
Laud the bod.
Yeah.
Okay. Adrian, next question, please.
Okay, the next question is from Harry. What will happen to Putin should he fail to take the Ukraine?
Yeah, I mean, I think that would be a difficult one for him to be able to digest politically. I mean, that kind of failure. He's been able to portray pretty much every other conflict that he's been in as a success. That's been part of his aura. So to come away with some kind of defeat, I'm not convinced that he would be able to survive that in combination with everything else that's happened in Russia. I mean, maybe it wouldn't mean that he would be kind of deposed right away, but I would think that, even though Russia is an autocratic regime, elections can matter in certain ways. And his next presidential election is 2024. And one reason it can matter is because it gives people who are dissatisfied with him a concrete time at which they know that everybody else is focused on this and maybe can coordinate their actions. And so, it's possible, that maybe kind of in the run up to that, which is only a couple of years away, that's when you'd see those kind of consequences play out. Maybe he would try to organize some kind of exit strategy. I don't know, find a nice villa somewhere in China. I don't know if Belarus would be that far behind Russia in terms of regime change if if he suffered defeat. But I think it would be bad, and I'd be surprised if he really was able to hang on to 3036 after that.
Okay, thank you. Tom asked, do you see prospects for a ceasefire and some kind of settlement from the negotiations between Ukraine and Russia?
Yeah, I mean, that's a difficult one. I think the key question is what Ukrainians and its government would be willing to give up in order to achieve a ceasefire. And from talking to Ukrainians and just studying Ukraine for a long time, I'm not seeing a whole lot that they're willing to, give up for this at this point. Partly because I think that after what happened to them in 2014 with Crimea and the Donbass, they kind of realized, okay, well, we stop now, and what's going to stop this all from happening again and them just coming back at us again later. So I think, what they might be willing to negotiate is some sort of, pledge of neutrality, right? If they kind of say, okay, well, we're willing to say that we're not going to be in NATO anytime soon. Maybe there could be something like that could, be put on the table for them. But I just don't see them being willing at all to give up any actual territory. And so, it may, the key, I think, then may be where the, even for a ceasefire, right? Unless the ceasefire is just explicitly meant to be, and is credibly a way for losing Russian forces just to get out. But then again, if Russian forces are losing, I don't see why the Ukrainians would want to agree to a ceasefire. I think they're going to want to sort of, push it to the end. In that case, then, maybe the ceasefire would be more about, what Russia is going to have to do in the future to guarantee Ukrainian security. So, I mean, I guess it's very hard for me to see what a ceasefire looks like at this point. At least while Ukrainian forces are holding up against the Russians.
Could you see any final agreement entailing the repatriation of Russians or Russian speakers, say out of the Donbass or other areas, back to Russia?
Well, I mean, there are, certainly I think what would be, what the Ukrainians are going to demand and insist on would be, getting rid of the Russian troops and the Russian forces that are there. And I think they would be quite happy to see the local Ukrainian, local Ukrainians that collaborated with the Russians gone. But, beyond that, I mean, there are not really that many Russians in that part of the country. I mean, there's some, but I think those Russians also see that area as their homeland. I don't know if I wouldn't expect the Ukrainians to try to expel them, and I don't think they would necessarily try to leave. I think what would happen more likely would be negotiations about how they would be represented, in a united Ukraine. And part of that would be the difficulty of dealing with the aftermath of the Russian occupation there, which has been absorption into the Russian information network, right? Which means they've been basically blasted by propaganda nonstop for 8 years now, and that has some effect. And so, how is that going to happen? So, I wouldn't expect population exchanges. I think it's more about representation, but at the same time, letting the people that allied with the Russian occupying force go back to Russia. I think that would certainly be something that the Ukrainians would not object to.
Right. Adrian?
Okay, Bill mentions in the comments, in a recent essay, Francis Fukuyama stated that Putin's invasion of Ukraine definitely marks the end of the post-Cold War era. He further said, "We are living in Vladimir Putin's world now, a world in which sheer force tramples over rule of law and democratic rights."
I think, to comment on that, I think much depends on how the war goes. I think like that kind of statement made more sense, at least, made the most sense kind of before we saw the Ukrainian resistance. And if you thought that Putin was just going to take Ukraine very quickly, basically he's already got Belarus. Even if he didn't annex the territory, right, he's recreating kind of a Warsaw Pact type bloc that maybe doesn't extend as far as it used to, but would divide the world. But if this is not successful, then I don't think the future is necessarily that dark. I think one thing that the Ukrainians have already accomplished by resisting to this degree is to show that, well, this is not a cakewalk. That countries that try to take over at least other big industrial countries, you're not going to be able to do that in a costless way. And so, again, I'm not a China specialist, but, you hear people talking about how, well, maybe this has caused, Beijing to rethink the wisdom of moving militarily on Taiwan, right? If the if the Ukrainians were able to resist this fiercely, maybe that's something that they should be considering as well. So I think had Russia just like won right away, had it just in fact been a cakewalk, they just kind of quickly were able to occupy the whole of Ukraine, subjugate it, no significant resistance, then maybe we're back in this kind of divided sort of Cold War sort of world where autocrats reign. But right now, I think I don't think that's the case. I think it's dangerous because Russia has broken some major taboos in international relations. But the fact that it's proven very, very costly, I think, is something that works in the favor of some kind of the possibility of some sort of return to more orderly international relations, at least to the degree that, so at least there's cost involved in breaking these rules. And if Putin's defeated, then I think maybe in the end, this could actually be a push in the other direction.
Okay, thank you. Warren has his hand up. Warren, do you want to unmute yourself?
Yes. What I'd like is your view of the following historical perspective. That is, in 1914 or maybe 1917, the U.S. was a late and reluctant participant in World War I. In 1939 or maybe 1941, we found ourselves also as late and reluctant participants in World War II. And here we have ourselves in 2022, also looking like we're going to be late and reluctant participants in whatever you want to call World War III. And there I would say that words have meaning and consequences. And in my mind, World War III began some time ago when we had another tyrant begin to gobble up his neighbors, either Georgia or Ossetia or Crimea, and now Ukraine. So I'd like your view of that perspective.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I could just say I sure hope it's not going to come to that. But I think it's wise. History teaches us not to ignore those possibilities. I think one big difference, of course, that we have now, which could make things worse or perhaps better, is that we have nuclear weapons. Worse if nuclear weapons get pulled into this conflict, right? If they actually get used. On the other hand, maybe on some level, they act as a constraining factor on, kind of just how far, different countries will go. Kind of to go back to the last question again. I mean, one of the worst case scenarios, if Russia basically is allowed just to kind of keep going and to fight its war and subjugate Ukraine eventually, we're effectively kind of dividing up the world in some ways, right? Because we have sort of the NATO bloc that is sort of secure from Russia, and the rest of the world is kind of vulnerable to however far, at least the world around Russia, to however far it wants to go.
Haven't we already ceded Ukraine to Russia?
Well, that's kind of my point, is that like I don't think we've ceded it entirely, right? Like we're willing to arm it to some degree. But yes, I mean, I think if Putin is able to, chew it up and everybody else just stands by, then, there's a sense in which it's de facto, relegated to Russia's domain. And I think that's a big kind of moral problem. And so, I think kind of at least, kind of the other forms of weaponry, especially given how fiercely the Ukrainians have fought, at least give the Ukrainians a fighting chance. And, I mean, my own perspective is that even if Russia somehow wins this, grinds it out, and quote unquote, wins it, subjugates Ukraine completely in order to conquer it, sort of like Hamilton, right? Kind of like, kill your friends and family to show you of my love. That basically, that's not going to end it. I mean, there's going to be, he's not going to be able, Ukrainians have risen up time and time again against Russian linked authorities. And so, I think there are forces that would work against a real kind of Cold War type scenario. But I do think that, I mean, there's a chance that this could escalate, clearly, right? If kind of some the military, the battle heats up, some missiles hit Poland, right? This recently happened kind of nearby Poland, right? Then, there is the possibility this could escalate. And, my hope would be that the fact that everybody's a nuclear power leads people to think, whoa, wait a minute. You have to hope that maybe that's a red line for China as well, right? That maybe on one hand, China is happy for Russia and kind of the West to go at it because they get to sit there and everybody else weakening themselves and then they get better, right? But, would they really be okay with Russia going nuclear? I'm not sure about that, right? And so, that may be even a line that kind of leads China to maybe not follow Russia. And so, that would kind of break with the pattern of the previous world wars, right? Where you get these kind of clear alliances crystallizing and drawing each other into conflict, whereas, maybe it wouldn't quite go that far in this particular case. But, I'm just speculating there. I agree the precedents are dangerous. One other thing that happened in World War I as well, were a series of military defeats led to the crumbling of the Russian army and the fall of the Tsar. So, that could be a more hopeful possible outcome there, kind of based from a different historical analogy from World War I.
Yeah, I'm not sure that Russia under Putin has the same view of the use of tactical nuclear weapons that we in the West have, based on a number of things, not just including the number of weapons they have in their arsenal, but the fact that many of their conventional military games that they play themselves, that we have looked at, have always ended with the use of low-yield tactical nuclear weapons.
Yeah, on Russian television, I have seen, references to, the United States dropping the bombs on Japan, right, as kind of American hypocrisy, right? It's like they condemn nuclear weapons, but look, they did it. They did it first in the world. So,
right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Adrian, we're ticking down toward 4 o'clock. Do we have another question for the professor?
We have 2 more questions. I'm not sure how much time they'll take, but the first one is from Larry. In light of your understanding of Ukraine, what are the prospects for sustained guerrilla warfare like happened in Afghanistan when the USSR invaded?
I think the will is there among Ukrainians, and there are histories of insurgency there, right, that even held up against Soviet forces after World War II for a number of years before it was extinguished, by a massively powerful totalitarian regime under Stalin. The challenge that Ukrainians would face in that kind of scenario is that the insurgency is helped by difficult terrain like mountains, and kind of in Western Ukraine, there's mountainous territory, but not really in the rest of Ukraine. So, on the other hand, they're big cities, which I think can also be, sites for insurgency. So, my guess is it wouldn't be like Afghanistan, but it would still be very difficult just because, the will of the population in Ukraine is very strong. And, my guess is that there would be a lot of people, willing to quietly or even openly, support kind of guerrilla tactics to the extent that they could be, mobilized against Russia. And then, the other factor here, I think, is cyber, right? Ukrainians are pretty good at cyber, so maybe there'd be different forms of sort of guerrilla resistance that they could use that you wouldn't really see in other places, at least not so far.
Okay, just one more. This is from Sandra. How would the impact affect shipping and U.S. warships going to and coming from the Black Sea trade and Turkey?
Another big question. And I think a key factor there is Turkey, right? Turkey has no interest in letting the Black Sea become a Russian lake, given it has a lot of Black Sea shoreline as well, and controls the critical straits. So if Russia were to take the Black Sea coast, the rest of it from Ukraine, then yeah, certainly that would give it a big position in the Black Sea. But you still have Turkey there, and I'm not. You have Georgia. There are a few other like places like that Russia wouldn't control. But my guess is that would be something that really starts to provoke Turkey before Russia would actually fully be able to control it. So, what it would affect, of course, is like shipping to Ukraine. It'd have to go through Russia, if Russia controlled only the Black Sea ports. But I would strongly bet that Turkey is going to do everything they can to, make sure that Russia doesn't fully dominate the Black Sea.
Professor, before letting you go, I'd just like to sneak in one more question for a very quick answer, if you will.
Yeah, sure.
We all know about George Kennan, the State Department officer who adopted the whole policy of containment. In 1997, he said that expanding NATO would be the most fateful error in American policy in the entire post-Cold War era. There's a Russian scholar at Princeton University, Stephen Kotkin, who disagrees with that, saying that that assumes that had we not done that, Russia would have changed and would become a more benevolent country. Can you agree or disagree with one or the other of them?
Well, these are all counterfactuals. I guess like what I would say at the outset is that even if Kennan was right, that none of that justifies what Russia is doing, and it certainly doesn't mean that like we should be denying countries like Ukraine the right to make their own foreign policy choices, right? But the counterfactual question of might this somehow have made Putin less likely to adopt the horrific decision that he made to invade Ukraine and do a lot of the other things. It's hard to say. I guess what I would say is maybe other things in combination could have helped, maybe even led to kind of contributed to Russia going in a very different direction early on. In the set, it's a big question. So it's very hard. I'm trying to answer it very quickly, but I'm not succeeding. But I do think that sort of if NATO expansion wasn't so much the problem, but it was the expansion of the mission to NATO. So I think maybe had NATO not intervened in Kosovo, for example, right, and not intervened in Serbia, maybe that kind of thing might have made some difference. But then again, people like Putin, they tend to find a lot of reasons to be upset regardless. And as I mentioned before, even before NATO expansion really started, there was already a lot of people blaming the West for economic subjugation, things like that. So I think maybe what could have been done would have been early on to whether it would have kind of been above NATO, around it would have been more effort to create a larger security community that might have embraced Russia, a little more powerfully in ways that might have kind of constrained it from going in this direction that it's gone under Putin. But it's just so hard. You can't rerun history. I guess I tend to lean a little more towards the Kotkin side than the Kennan side on that one. But I just don't know in the end.
Oh, indeed. Professor, the one thing we do know is that you've given us a marvelous presentation today and a lot to think about, and we're really, really very, very grateful that you've given us so much time. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you all. I found it a really
Thank
great discussion. A lot of the contributions and the questions and comments are really fascinating to me. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Now I'm going to turn it back to Adrian, who I think has one more surprise guest speaker for us this afternoon. Before we conclude, none other than the Terminator himself.
Well, that's a good way to put it, Mike. Okay, bear with me one moment. If everybody has a few extra minutes, I'm going to do just that.
Just in case people haven't seen him yet.
Hello, everybody.
and thank you for sharing your time with me. I'm sending this message through various different channels to reach my dear Russian friends and the Russian soldiers serving in Ukraine. I'm speaking to you today because there are things that are going on in the world that are being kept from you, terrible things that you should know about. But before I talk about the harsh realities, let me just tell you about the Russian who became my hero. In 1961, when I was 14 years old, a very good friend of mine invited me to come to Vienna and to watch the World Weightlifting Championships. I was in the audience when Yuri Petrovich Vlasov won the World Championship title, becoming the first human being to lift 200 kilograms over his head. And somehow a friend of mine got me backstage. All of a sudden, there I was, a 14-year-old boy, standing in front of the strongest man in the world. I couldn't believe it. He reached out to shake my hand. I mean, I still had a boy's hand. He had this powerful man's hand that swallowed mine. But he was kind, and he smiled at me. I would never forget that day. Never. I went home and I put his photo above my bed to inspire me when I started lifting weights. My father told me to take down that picture and to find a German or an Austrian hero. He got really angry and we argued back and forth. He didn't like Russians because of his experience in the Second World War. You see, he was injured at Leningrad, where the Nazi army that he was part of did vicious harm to the great city and to its brave people. But I did not take the photograph down, no, because it didn't matter to me what flag Yuri Vlasov carried. My connections to Russia didn't stop there, by the way. Oh, it actually deepened when I traveled there with bodybuilding and for my movies and met all my Russian fans. And on one of those trips, I remember, I met Yuri Vlasov once again. It was in Moscow during the filming of Red Heat, which was the first American movie allowed to film in Red Square. Now, he and I spent the whole day together. He was so thoughtful, so kind, and so smart, and, of course, very giving. He gave me this beautiful blue coffee cup. And ever since then, I've been drinking my coffee out of every morning. Now, the reason why I'm telling you all of those things is that ever since I was 14 years old, I've had nothing but affections and respect for the people of Russia. The strength and the heart of the Russian people have always inspired me. And that is why I hope that you will let me tell you the truth about the war in Ukraine and what is happening there. No one likes to hear something critical of the government, I understand that. But as a longtime friend of the Russian people, I hope that you will hear what I have to say. And may I remind you that I speak with the same heartfelt concern as I spoke to the American people when there was an attempted insurrection on January 6th last year, when a wild crowd was storming the US Capitol, trying to overthrow our government. You see, there are moments like this that are so wrong, and then we have to speak up. And it's exactly the same with your government. I know that your government has told you that this is a war to denazify Ukraine. Denazify Ukraine? This is not true. Ukraine is a country with a Jewish president, I might add, whose father's 3 brothers were all murdered by the Nazis. You see, Ukraine did not start this war. Neither did nationalists or Nazis. Those in power in the Kremlin started this war. This is not the Russian people's war. No. As a matter of fact, let me tell you, what you should know is that 141 nations at the UN voted that Russia was the aggressor and called for it to remove its troops immediately. Only 4 countries in the entire world voted with Russia. That is a fact. See, the world has turned against Russia because of its actions in Ukraine. Whole city blocks have been flattened by Russian artillery and bombs, including a children's hospital and a maternity hospital. 3 million Ukrainian refugees, mainly women, children, and elderly, fled their country, and many more are trying to seek to get out. It is a humanitarian crisis. Because of its brutality, Russia is now isolated from the society of nations. You're also not being told the truth about the consequences of this war on Russia itself. I regret to tell you that thousands of Russian soldiers that have been killed. They have been caught between Ukrainians fighting for their homeland and the Russian leadership fighting for conquest. Massive amounts of Russian equipment have been destroyed or abandoned. The destruction that Russian bombs are raining down upon innocent civilians has so outraged the world that the strongest global economic sanctions ever taken have been imposed on your country. Those who don't deserve it on both sides of the war will suffer. The Russian government has lied not only to the citizens, but to its soldiers. Some of the soldiers were told they were going to fight Nazis. Some were told that the Ukrainian people would greet them like heroes. And some were told that they were simply going on exercise. They didn't even know that they were going into war. And some were told that they were there to protect ethnic Russians in Ukraine. None of this is true. The fact is that Russian soldiers have faced fierce resistance from the Ukrainians who want to protect their families and their country. When I see babies being pulled out of ruins, I think that I'm watching a documentary about the horrors of the Second World War, not the news of the day. And let me tell you, when my father arrived in Leningrad, he was all pumped up on the lies of his government. And when he left Leningrad, he was broken, physically and mentally. He lived the rest of his life in pain. Pain from a broken back, pain from the shrapnel that always reminded him of these terrible years, and pain from the guilt that he felt. To the Russian soldiers listening to this broadcast, you already know much of the truth that I've been speaking. You have seen it with your own eyes. I don't want you to be broken like my father. This is not the war to defend Russia that your grandfathers or your great-grandfathers fought. This is an illegal war. Your lives, your limbs, your futures are being sacrificed for a senseless war condemned by the entire world. Now, to those in power in the Kremlin, let me just ask you, why would you sacrifice those young men for your own ambitions? To the soldiers who are listening to this, remember that 11 million Russians have family connections to Ukraine. So every bullet you shoot a brother or a sister. Every bomb or every shell that falls is falling not on an enemy, but on a school, or a hospital, or a home. I know that the Russian people are not aware of such things are happening. So I urge the Russian people and the Russian soldiers in Ukraine to understand the propaganda and the disinformation that you are being told. I ask you to help me spread the truth. Let your fellow Russians know the human catastrophe that is happening in Ukraine. And to President Putin, I say, you started this war. You are leading this war. You can stop this war. Now, let me close with a message to all of the Russians who have been protesting on the streets against the invasion of Ukraine. The world has seen your bravery. We know that you have suffered the consequences of your courage. You have been arrested, you have been jailed, and you have been beaten. You are my new heroes. You have the strength of Yuri Petrovich Vlasov. You have the true heart of Russia. My dear Russian friends, may God bless you all.
Okay, well, thank you for joining us, everyone. Special thanks to Dr. Hale and Mike Carpenter. Our next program will be April 22nd, and we will discuss Myanmar and ASEAN. Our speaker will be Professor William Hale, Chair of the Stimson Center's Southeast Asia Forum. And we look forward to seeing you there.
Thank you.